Hi, welcome to session 2 of our study of the book of Jonah, Discovering God's Faithfulness. My name is Suzie. I'm one of the pastors who oversees groups at HTB. And to recap on what we explored last time in session 1, we explored how God sometimes asks us to do hard things. And we're often tempted to run in the opposite direction. But the story of Jonah shows us that even when we run, God remains with us. In this session, we'll work through chapter 2 of the book of Jonah and see how Jonah reacts to moments of darkness and despair. Let's start with an opening question. You might like to pause the video and to ask each other, what's the biggest storm you've been in? After that, if you're comfortable, someone might like to open in prayer, and then you can read through chapter 2 of the book of Jonah together. In our last session, we saw Jonah fail at his plan to run away from God, and instead he ends up being thrown off a boat in the middle of a storm, and in a bizarre twist, he's eaten by a huge fish. In chapter 2, Jonah is at the end of himself. He's in a very dark, very hopeless, very lonely place, and he's in the belly of a fish. And whatever you think about what's happening here in terms of history, this represents a moment where one of God's people is at a crisis point. They've hit rock bottom. And it's God's work in their life to bring them to the end of themselves. Jonah's experience becomes a way for us to think about similar moments of crisis in our own stories and how to navigate through those on the journey of faith. Let's pause now, and as much as you are comfortable, reflect on the following question together in your group. Have there ever been moments in your life where you felt at the end of yourself? And how did you respond? The image of Jonah in the belly of a fish is an image of being trapped in seasons of hardship, pain, frustration, and confusion. And because Jonah cannot escape again, his response is to process his pain in prayer. Jonah's prayer can be a lens for us as we process our own experiences of hardship, suffering, pain, and confusion. And there are 3 things that we can learn from Jonah's prayer. Firstly, Jonah is real about his circumstances. There's no sugarcoating here. Jonah is real, honest, and raw. Look at the language that he uses. Engulfing waters threatened me, or were at my throat, in verse 5. To the roots of the mountains I sank down, the earth beneath barred me in forever, in verse 6. My life was ebbing away, in verse 7. There's a temptation to think that we must be our best selves before God in prayer, that we are to dust ourselves off, sit up straight, plaster on a smile, and pray our best words. Yet there are countless stories in the Bible of people praying just as they are, allowing what's in the depths of their heart to come to the surface in prayer. Even Jesus, as he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane in Luke 22, processed very deep pain and fear before God in prayer. And both these examples show us that God is a safe place for us to process our pain, struggle, and frustration in prayer. He's not shocked or surprised, but he invites us to be truly real about how we feel before him. Jonah was real about his circumstances. Secondly, Jonah worships with thankfulness. Nearly every line of Jonah's prayer comes from a psalm, including "In my distress" from Psalm 18, 30 and 120. "Deep in the realm of the dead" from Psalm 18. "Waves and breakers" from Psalm 42. "Banished from your sight" from Psalm 139. And "Salvation comes from the Lord" in Psalm 3. The book of Psalms is the prayer and worship book of the Bible, and Jonah is likely using the Psalms to bring words to his feelings when he cannot find those words himself. And there are a number of different ways to categorize the Psalms in the Bible, but they generally fall into two categories. Psalms of lament, where a person or people are suffering and they cry out to God for breakthrough. And then Psalms of praise and thanksgiving. What's fascinating about Jonah's prayer is that whilst we might expect him to pray a psalm of lament whilst in the belly of a fish, his prayer is actually more similar to the style and tone of a psalm of thanksgiving. Yes, Jonah is real, raw, and honest about what's going on for him, but he's also primarily giving thanks to God. He's worshipping in the midst of the belly of a fish. And we'll explore more of that in a moment. But before we do, let's take a moment now to pause and reflect together. Firstly, how easy do you find it to be real and honest with God during hardship? And secondly, how easy do you find it to worship God in the midst of hardship? The third thing that we can learn from Jonah's prayer is that Jonah acknowledges God's faithfulness. Look at what Jonah says about God. "In my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead, I called for help, and you listened to my cry," in verse 2. "But you, Lord my God, brought my life up from the pit," in verse 6. "When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you," in verse 7. "I will say, salvation comes from the Lord," in verse 9. Sometimes when we're in seasons of hardship, when things are falling apart, when we feel confused or alone or trapped by our lives' circumstances, it can be easy to think that God is not listening, that He's nowhere to be found. But Jonah's prayer shows us it's precisely in these moments of hardship that we discover the faithfulness of God. It's precisely in these moments where we feel most alone that God shows us just how present He is. At his lowest point, Jonah reminds himself of the faithfulness of God. He remembers how God has shown him favor, grace, and mercy. He looks at the mess that he's in, the mess of his own making, and he reminds himself that God has been and He will be faithful to him. In the mundane and the everyday, when we can easily rely on ourselves, we can fall into the temptation to stumble away from God and His direction for our lives. But when storms come, even though they're difficult, there are moments where we're confronted with the truth of ourselves, and we see clearly how we have nothing if not by the goodness and grace of God. Storms are an opportunity to remind ourselves of the faithfulness of God and to wait with expectancy for Him to demonstrate His faithfulness again. Let's take some time now to pause and to reflect together. Perhaps if you're in a season of difficulty right now, reflect together on how you might be able to view this as an opportunity to discover afresh the goodness of God and your dependence on Him. I invite you now to take some time to pray for one another in your groups. Maybe like Jonah, you might like to turn to the book of the Psalms and to choose a psalm to use as a prayer over each other and over your lives.